So the next thing we're going to cover is the Collinearity Diagnostics. You can see scrolling over, it's going to give you coefficient values for each of these predictors that we dropped in. I'm going to focus mostly on the ones that to keep the variable view we have on screen to be something we can actually interpret. So there's a general rule of thumb when it comes to how to interpret these diagnostics. So first of all, the concept of collinearity is identifying this idea that estimators or predictors should not be too highly correlated with each other, not with the outcome variable first or GPA. They should not be highly correlated with each other. So for example, ACT English and ACT reading, we're going to probably assume have a pretty high correlation because there likely is a relationship that if you perform well on the English, that you're also going to probably perform well on the reading because of the skill sets required are likely highly linked versus maybe more so on the opposite end of performance spectrum for math and science. So multicollinearity would make it really hard to isolate the individual effect of predictors. It's going to inflate standard errors, making it harder to detect significance and something of value that we have in our model. So the way I like to look at it is imagine having two GPA devices giving the same directions. You're using Waze, you're using Google Maps at the same time. It's really hard to tell which one is actually helping you get there when you're running two because there's too much overlap. You can't really tell which one's doing the actual work for all intents and purposes. So when predictors say the same thing, the model can't tell who deserves credit. It actually, what it can do is dampen the impact of those variables because of the presence of essentially like close to mirror image of each other. So let me give you some key terms of these collinearity diagnostics. So the three things we have that are of significance is eigenvalue, condition index, and then variance proportions. So an eigenvalue is how much variance is explained by each dimension. So low values likely mean problematic. Condition index is the higher this is, the more likely there is to be collinearity. And then variance proportion shows how much of a single variable's variance loads onto each dimension. So it's problematic if there are high values shared by multiple predictors on high dimension or high index dimensions. And then we would say in general that a condition index greater than 30 is a cause for concern. And then any variance proportions on the same high index dimension for two or more above 0.5 would be something worth considering. So the general rule of thumb, as I applied to, is that anything on the condition index, which is here, we want anything below or anything above 30 is a concern. So we get to the 13th dimension here, and that's where we start to see some concern. So we'll actually get into what that means. And then variance proportions, which is all of these coefficients in here. We want to look for any that we want these values to be below 0.5. So any that is above 0.5 on the same dimension are suggesting that these are a red flag for two or more predictors to be highly collinear, and we should probably make a decision about whether or not we want to remove one of them. So let's go through the starting point, and I'll get my marker out here. So this is the first one we have concern with because we are a condition index of above 30. So this is dimension 13. Our condition index is 30.662. Then we go through and we look at where they have high variance proportions. And intuitively, obviously, the casual observer, as I alluded to, ACT English and ACT reading have scores that are very high. 0.87 being above 0.5 says that the same high dimension for two can be a red flag. So what we can interpret here is that with the 0.87 of 0.41 is that ACT English and ACT reading are contributing jointly to multicollinearity. So they may have overlapping information in which they bring to the model itself. So we might consider removing one or the other. And then we look to also at, for instance, dimension 14 with a condition index of 36.682. If we go over, we see that the ACT math and the ACT science have 0.49 and 0.88. Interestingly, we saw that they are both statistically significant They clearly have contributions to the model, but interestingly to see what else is collinear to it, ACT reading falling along the same dimensions as well, whereas nothing else as we go down the line is at the same level. So we see the bulk of collinearity here to be in the ACT realm, which is about to be expected. And then if we get to dimension 15, we're like well over 30 at this point, suggesting that we have a major red flag. And variance proportions that we see, the constant itself at 0.98 is slightly collinear with, let's see, age. And then, yeah, that's it. So we essentially would suggest that we have some pretty good scale, so what we call scale instability with the intercept and age. So it's not a variable level collinearity threat. It's common and typically not a major concern unless the predictors involved are of what we would consider primary interest here. So since age wasn't significant anyway, we really probably don't have anything worth noting here. But if that were the case and it were significant, we might look to either suppress the constant or consider what to do about it from there. And then from there, we can go back up and we're going to look at a whole different rule of thumb when it comes to collinearity. And I'll go ahead and put this up on screen. So we have variance inflation factors looking at two things. So we want to make sure that tolerance above 0.1, anything above 0.1 means the tolerance is good. So that's the first thing to evaluate. The second thing to evaluate is what we call the variance inflation factor, that score. So we would ideally like to keep it below 5. What would be great is if they were below 2. So 0 to 1 means there's no collinearity. That would be ideal. 1 to 2 is very low collinearity. We would call this acceptable. 2 to 5, we'd call it moderate. We'd say monitor. It's probably okay, but consider some dimension reduction, maybe going through a principal components analysis to try to collapse variables together so that they're having impact to the model and not being counterintuitive themselves. And then 5 to 10, we would consider high collinearity. We would call this a caution flag, investigate further. And anything 10 plus would be severe and serious issues. So what do we do if the VIF is high? We either want to go through a PCA or some kind of combined variables or some other way in which to collapse variables or remove or combine for redundant information. We might standardize or center them by building like an interaction term, as I noted, using principal components analysis, or you can even use another form of regression where multicollinearity is mitigated for all intents and purposes. So overall, what we see, again, our rule of thumb, we want our tolerance above 0.1. Good news is every single one of these is well above 0.1. So the next thing we want to look for is we really hope that at a minimum we're below 5 in every factor, and we are. And in fact, we only have 4 overall that are above 2. So they're on the low end of 2 to 5. So we call that moderate collinearity. You might want to monitor it, probably fine, but you might want to consider some level of dimension reduction. But for all intents and purposes, we see that ACT math and ACT science have a significant contribution to the model. So we might remove English or reading. We might combine those. We saw that they have a high collinearity diagnostic down here in dimension 13. So that might give us an opportunity to combine the two, maybe take an average of those two scores and use them as another variable, or just drop them all together or run it stepwise just to see what happens that way.